Hey everyone, it's Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm here with my friend and colleague Gager, who is our Prairie Director, and we're going to get right into it because we got some big news on the carbon tax fight. Okay, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith just announced that she will not be increasing the industrial carbon tax in Alberta. Take a listen to what Premier Smith said.
That's why today we're announcing that effective immediately, Alberta is freezing the industrial carbon tax under Alberta's Technology and Innovation Emissions Reduction System, or TIER, at $95 per tonne of emissions. This price was set to increase to $110 per tonne next year and continue increasing to $170 per tonne by 2030. Now, let me be clear, Alberta remains committed to reducing emissions through the development and implementation of new technologies, not unrealistically high taxes, while responsibly powering the world for decades to come. Alberta's industrial carbon tax system, TIER, has been in place since 2007. Our approach has reduced emissions in intensity by over 22% and reduced overall emissions by an estimated 7.2%, while production increased by 90%. We have a reasonable system in place that's working, but any additional increases past $100 per tonne will wipe out any of the benefits we've seen. That means fewer jobs for Albertans, less revenue to invest in our public services, and decreased innovation across our industries. But instead of supporting our industry, Ottawa wants to increase their industrial carbon tax to $170 per tonne by 2030. Now, if industry told us that any increase past $100 per tonne would be harmful, you can imagine what a $170 tonne industrial carbon tax would do to our industry. That would be devastating to Alberta's economy. This is yet another example of Ottawa overstepping into our provincial jurisdiction with reckless policies that damage our industry.
All right, Gage, what do you make of that?
Well, the first thing, Franco, is that it's great to see that Alberta is going to take that next step in the fight against carbon taxes. Right, we're seeing the freeze of this industrial carbon tax. That means going forward, these businesses aren't going to be hit with higher and higher industrial carbon taxes. It means it's going to save taxpayers money, protect jobs, help grow the economy. Now, of course, we're always looking to see Alberta do more. We want to see the government move towards getting that industrial carbon tax rate to zero to make sure that taxpayers in the economy can benefit as much as possible. So that's what we're looking for, because it's kind of worth highlighting again how the industrial carbon tax hits businesses and then ultimately hits taxpayers' wallets, right? So when businesses are forced to pay that industrial carbon tax, it increases their costs. And then those costs, unfortunately, have to be passed down to consumers. And that's hit taxpayer wallets, it's everyone's wallets. And that means it's more difficult for those businesses to make money. And then it means it leaves less money in your pocket when you have to pay those increased costs.
Yeah, so I think you're right? A good first step. Of course, we'd like to see all carbon taxes completely ended here in Canada. And speaking of getting rid of all carbon taxes, let's throw to a pretty recent clip from Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
Saskatchewan is now a carbon tax-free province, the first carbon tax-free province in Canada. Now that the two major federal parties and their leaders have announced their plans for removing the carbon tax, Saskatchewan is taking the next step by reducing the industrial carbon tax rate charged in our province to zero, to give our consumers a break and to make our industries more competitive in this new tariff environment. So what does this mean for you? Well, the immediate effect is the removal of the carbon tax on your Sask power bills, saving Saskatchewan families and small businesses hundreds of dollars a year. And in the longer term, it will reduce the cost of other consumer products that have the industrial carbon tax built right into their price. Saskatchewan is producing some of the most sustainable products in the world today. We want to create the environment to produce more of those sustainable products, to make our industries more competitive in the face of U.S. and Chinese tariffs, and to protect and create Canadian jobs right here in Saskatchewan. Making Saskatchewan a carbon tax-free province will do just that. And I would hope that all of the parties running in the federal election would agree with those objectives and allow the provinces to regulate in this area without imposing the federal backstop.
All right, Gage, what do you make of that?
Well, that's just great, right? Saskatchewan is the only totally carbon tax-free jurisdiction in the country because, as you saw in that clip there, Premier Scott Moe decided to completely scrap Saskatchewan's industrial carbon tax. As we were talking about with Alberta, that helps businesses lower cost, and that means that it helps consumers lower costs and it helps taxpayers. And when Scott Moe made that announcement, it was so important is that almost everyone and their dog was putting out statements saying, this is such a great idea. It's helping us lower costs. It's helping us save money. It was the right thing to do. And that's why it's such a good job that Moe took that initiative, took that next step in the carbon tax fight, and became the first carbon tax-free province in the country.
And yeah, huge kudos to Premier Moe out there, because he was really the first premier to take a shot at that hidden carbon tax on businesses, right? Like, so for a while, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been attacking the industrial carbon tax, the wonky term for it, but really it's just a hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses. And, you know, us at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we've been railing against it for a long time, but really Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, was the first premier to come out on record against that hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses. And, you know, it's not the first time that Mr. Moe has really taken the lead against the fight against carbon taxers. Gage, why don't you kind of remind our audience how in the past Premier Moe has also told Ottawa's carbon tax collectors to take a hike?
Yeah, exactly. Saskatchewan has been a leader in the fight against carbon taxes for a long time, and it's great to see. Almost a little over a year ago, Scott Moe announced that he would not be collecting home heating carbon taxes in the province of Saskatchewan, following after the federal government gave an Atlantic carve-out on home heating. He said, that's not fair that some Canadians have to pay this carbon tax and not others, so we're taking it off home heating for Saskatchewanians. And it worked out great. For over the first year that they had it off, the average family saved about $400 for not having to pay that carbon tax on home heating. And it was great to see. And during that time, people were able to keep saving. And now they're taking that next step again with getting rid of the industrial carbon tax.
Yeah, and look, let's bring in the federal element here, right? Because I think this is really the key to understanding this huge fight that is brewing here. So, folks, as you know, right, Carney doesn't want to end all carbon taxes. He wants to change the carbon tax, right? He set the consumer carbon tax rate to 0, but he wants to hammer Canadian businesses with his hidden carbon tax, this industrial carbon tax. And you don't have to believe our word for it. Listen to this longer clip from Carney explaining to a crowd what he wants to do with the carbon tax. And remember, folks, listen for that word change. Change the carbon tax, not scrap the carbon tax. Take a listen to what Carney said here.
But I've always been a pragmatist. And so when I see something that's not working, I try to change it. And I'm going to start with an example of that, which is the consumer carbon tax. Good idea on paper, put into action with the best intentions, but something that's become very divisive in our country. Very divisive. And if people don't buy into a policy or change, doesn't matter how good it is, it's not right. So the issue wasn't, to coin a phrase, whether to axe the tax. The issue was how to change it. How to change it in all its respects. Because the easiest thing is just to literally axe the tax. But if you axe the tax, well, first, our emissions aren't going to go down, and maybe you don't care. Maybe you don't believe in climate change. Oh yeah. Maybe you think for the first time in Canada's history, we're not going to pull our weight in a big global problem. It's not the Canada I know, but maybe that's the Canada somebody's trying to create. It's not right, but people try. Maybe you don't recognize that the average family, not here in BC where you get, but the average family across Canada gets $700 more back in the rebate than they pay in the tax. Okay? And I know, but across the country, elsewhere in the country. And particularly in places, rural communities, where it really matters. So you don't care about that, and you don't think our businesses need to get their emissions down. So in changing the carbon tax, what we put out 10 days or so ago, 2 weeks ago, we addressed all those things. We're getting rid of the consumer carbon tax. We're getting rid of the carbon tax on small businesses. We're getting rid of the carbon tax on farms. We're making the large companies pay for everybody, including here in Kelowna, across BC.
All right, Gage, what do you make of that clip?
Well, what I think about that clip that's so important is it highlights why it's important for taxpayers to keep fighting carbon taxes now. Why it's so important that both Alberta and Saskatchewan are moving on the hidden carbon tax, trying to decrease the cost. Because Carney's being pretty vague there. He's saying change, right? Improve and tighten is some other words that he's used. I mean, if you're a politician, that usually means make more expensive. So it's really great that some provinces are out there fighting that fight, and that's why taxpayers should keep on it, right? Because if Carney wants to keep jacking up this hidden carbon tax in the future, these proactive steps by Alberta and Saskatchewan are the best way to defend against those hikes and save money for their taxpayers.
Okay, and then what did you make near the end of that clip? How, Carney's trying to spin Canadians, claiming, "Oh, don't worry, folks, you won't pay this carbon tax. It's just the large companies that will."
Well, Canadians are smarter than that. We went out and we did a poll and we showed that 70% of Canadians believe that businesses are going to be forced to pass those costs on to consumers. So Carney can say whatever he wants about his plan, but Canadians don't believe it. They know that they're going to have to pay those costs. And that's a really important part as well. He can do whatever spin he wants, but Canadians know that they'll be paying the cost of this carbon tax.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that polling. We commissioned Leger, a reputable national polling firm, to do that. And it showed that only 9% believed Carney, right? That businesses are going to pay most of the costs. I mean, Canadians just understand that a carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax. That will make life more expensive. And of course, look, when the federal government hammers refineries with carbon taxes, that makes gasoline and diesel more expensive, right? When the federal government hammers utilities with carbon taxes, well, that makes your home heating bill more expensive. And when the federal government hammers fertilizer plants with carbon taxes, that increases costs for farmers, and that makes your grocery haul more expensive. Now, folks, I just kind of want to tie this all together with where I see this going. And I see this potentially leading to a huge fight between Ottawa and the provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. Because remember, Carney has given every indication that he wants to crank up that hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses every single year. Well, Scott Moe in Saskatchewan got rid of that industrial carbon tax, and Danielle Smith in Alberta says that she's not going to increase it. So I think this could lead to a fight. Now, where the things become interesting is that, remember, for years, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been calling out the unfair carbon tax treatment, where, Quebec for years was allowed to pay lower carbon taxes than the rest of Canada. So remember, let's go back to the 2024 carbon tax increase from Trudeau. Well, after that time, we showed that like Quebec's carbon tax was 13 cents per liter of gas, whereas the carbon tax in the rest of Canada was about 17 cents per liter of gas. Now, the federal government always claimed that the carbon tax had to be roughly equal across Canada. And of course, that isn't equal, right? It reminds me of, all provinces are treated equally, just some provinces, i.e. Quebec, are treated more equally than the others. But then that gap, that carbon tax unfairness, was expected to grow over time, right? Where by 2030, you essentially had Quebec's carbon tax costing 14 cents a liter of gas less than in the rest of Canada. So what does that all mean? Well, look, for years, Ottawa didn't fight Quebec when Quebec was charging lower carbon tax rates than the rest of Canada. So the question now with Alberta, Saskatchewan is Ottawa going to fight Alberta and Saskatchewan's carbon tax protection, so to speak, for their constituents and their taxpayers? So folks, look, the fight against carbon taxes is not over. It's really, really starting to heat up right now. And you can help the Canadian taxpayers fight back against the carbon taxers in Ottawa. Head over to taxpayer.com. We've got a great petition for you to sign. Stop the hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses.